I'm Jessica Strand, the events director, and no, I have no relationship with Strand. I'm making that very quick. Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce, I have my, how strange, Robert Longo and Richard Price. Robert Longo's work has, I somehow misplaced my introduction for a different one, Martin Amis, which we're not going to introduce tonight. Anyway, Robert Longo's work has been shown all over the world. I'm paraphrasing what I know, and is at the Guggenheim and Whitney, at the Art Institute in Chicago, the Walker, and many other places. He has a new book out called Robert Longo Charcoal, and he's here with Richard Prince, who has this Prince. Actually, I have to just tell you what happened, because it's very funny. Someone said to me, you know, it's going to be with Richard Price. And I said, oh, and then I turned to Kate, who works in the office, and I said, Richard Price? She said, no, it's got to be Richard Prince. I said, yeah, it must be Richard Prince. You know, it makes a lot of sense. And then suddenly it went out, and then suddenly, oh my God. Anyway, who wrote Clockers, The Wanderers, many other books, wrote for The Wire, and has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, and many, many periodicals. I'd like to, tonight they will be in conversation, and then Robert Longo will sign, and I hope you join me in welcoming Robert Longo and Richard Price. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. Oh, yeah, hi. I guess you're all wondering why we brought you here.
Sorry, I'm a bit adolescent. Okay.
This is how our relationship started.
Yes. We knew each other in the formative years. Now we're the deformed years.
Yeah, we've made it from formative to mangled. Yeah, now it's like an old rap group that used to be like majorly cutting edge, and all of a sudden we're doing rap about wear your seatbelts. I don't know where to start. I had this great opening line, and I forgot it.
You were you're hanging out with her?
No. Yeah. I know I got to get on point, but I'm not sure where to start. I mean, I met Robert in Los Angeles in the very early '80s in a restaurant, and I knew jack shit about art, and now I know jack about art, you know, at that time, and I'm not quite sure how the chemistry worked that night, but I wound up in Robert's studio on Center Street, which he still has, you know, which was a Chinese sweatshop for the most part, the building, not a studio. And I remember looking at The Men in the Cities, Corporate Wars, some of his double panels, and it's like, oh, you're the kid from the projects that went to art school. Yeah, I'm the one that went to creative writing school. I mean, I just felt like this, my breath taken away, and this automatic kinship, you know. I mean, it was like a mini apocalypse, you know, just every image, and but. It was more than that. It was Robert's, you know, charisma in the studio, in you know, his circle of assistants and friends, and the magnificent art that was being made. That you know, I fell in love with him. You know, without deconstructing the art too profoundly. And it's always felt like that. when the Freud drawings came out, the A-bomb drawings, the roses, all you zombies. I watched, the construction of this magnificent model. The tigers, the breasts, the stars, the newborn babies. There was always this apocalypse that was going on. I mean, he's the only guy who could tie a baby's face to a tiger, to an open-mouthed white shark, to a red rose, to an A-bomb, and it all fit in together. And it's almost like my first question would be, how do you go from one group of images to another? But I kind of know without knowing, because it's all the same mind, and I recognize the mind, from choice to choice. I mean, the waves. So it's always about some kinetic power, iconic imagery of the 20th century. Although I guess we're in the 21st century now. Sorry, but I'm not being very eloquent, and I know that. I'm sorry, but let me just start out with that. Or I could tell you some really weird stories about us in the early days on South Street, which I'll save for later. But let me just start out with, how do you go from a group of images to a group of another images, and it feels seamless, but on the surface it looks like they just don't belong in the same zip code?
I knew you were going to ask that. I think that I think the simple way to explain some things is I think that for me, I've used this analogy many times, but it works. I think that making art for me is like, we all remember the old radios where you would physically tune in a radio station where you could actually feel it. You go a little bit one way, you miss it, you go another way, this way. I think for me, making art has always been this kind of way of finding this balance between something that is very personal, but is also very much in the world. And that to me is a way I somehow navigate what it is I'm doing. So that how the work proceeds is that's pretty much the guideline. But how this book, Charcoal, evolved, and how these sequences have happened, it was like they started with these Freud drawings, which was like this book that the photographs by Thomas Engelman, that these photographs he had taken of Freud's apartment a few days before Freud left Vienna for Nazis. This French friend of mine had given me, like in 1990, he gave me this book. He said, one day you'll find this interesting. It sat on my desk for like 8 years. I just never knew what to do with it. But I had been thinking a lot about Freud and Einstein, these ideas of these bookends to the 20th century and stuff like that. I don't know why. I kept on looking at the book and looking at these pictures of Freud's office. I kept on thinking so much about, I'm the youngest in my family. My brother was like 10 years older than I am. My father was like in his late 40s when I was born. My father had this heart condition. And he grew up in the city. We lived on Long Island at the time. And as a young child, we had to go once every 2 weeks to this doctor's office in the South Bronx that was this old doctor who happened to be a friend of my father's, a childhood friend of my father's. And I had to sit in the waiting room of this doctor's office. And while my father, because he had heart problems. And for some reason, I was looking at these Freud images. I kept on thinking these images of his office and stuff. I kept on thinking about my father and this office, this memory of being in this office. At the same time, I was incredibly fascinated by the Freud images. That there was that image of the front door of the street door of Freud's apartment building where there was a swastika hanging outside. And the idea that Freud was busy working in his apartment, trying to his offices, trying to understand the deep, dark secrets of her mind, while the Nazis were like outside in the streets actually doing it. This kind of like dichotomy of like what he was doing inside, what was happening outside. And at the same time, looking at these photographs, I was getting confused with my own memories. That what I started to do is when I started to draw these early versions of the Freud drawings, I tried to do it as if I was trying to remember being in Freud's office. The thing is, I did not go to Freud's apartment until I finished the series and the show was shown in Vienna, which was one of the weirdest things because it was, for like 3 years I'd been making these drawings, and then all of a sudden I go to this place where I had never been, where I had been, and it was really bizarre. But the thing was, the Freud drawings became like the vocabulary that established itself. But if I back up 1 second, my evolution as an artist is kind of interesting. The ebb and flow that you have as an artist. I was really lucky to have a lot of success in the 80s when I was younger, but I also was one of those artists that kind of got blamed for the 80s. And the ebb and flow of that is like the idea of how do you, I guess the most important thing as an artist is how do you stay relevant. And that the thing was, how do you keep on keeping on in that sense. And after I made this movie, after I made Johnny Mnemonic, I was really quite lost as far as what to do as an artist. And I really didn't know what to do. And at the time, my wife said, why don't you just go back to the studio and draw? And like, that seemed to always be the primal element to me through my work. So financially, things were difficult. I didn't have any assistants at the time, and I went back to the studio. And I also had, our youngest son was born, and my wife's European, and I started seeing the visual culture that I became so saturated. I would watch 2-3 TVs at the same time, remember? That she couldn't deal with that at all. I also became very aware of the whole visual landscape, this kind of phantom empire of like images. And I started this series when my youngest son was born because I didn't want to travel anymore. And I decided to do a drawing a day.
Magellan.
Right. And what I did is I decided that this idea that the amount of images that we see on a daily basis, that they enter you painlessly and quietly, and you have no idea what the recourse of the images are. So I did a drawing a day. I made 366 drawings, and what those drawings did is they basically spelled out the language structure, how to do the Freud drawings. But they were really small drawings like this. The Freud drawings became, I started going, and what happened is when I started doing the Freud drawings, I started working on a much larger scale. So the Freud drawings were the beginning, and they kind of happened at the same time as the wave drawings happened.
Well, the thing about the Freud drawings, which is basically, this empty office from all its, iconic images, the patient's couch, Freud's desk, the art that was in the office. There's a sense of waiting that's so explosive. Although, there's an absence that's like a presence there. I wasn't aware that this is right before he was going, but I also felt like, just to jump ahead, if you take Freud's office and then you jump ahead a couple of projects to the atom bombs, the quiet of that office. He was an atom bomb himself, and so I just felt like there was this 20th century violence in both, equally.
What's interesting is that when I did the bomb show, I realized that in between, at the same time I was doing the Freud stuff, I started doing these drawings of the waves that I had always been, my work seemed to be, people seemed to criticize it, and actually I was always kind of interested in this idea of power. And it seemed like when I started doing the waves, the waves seemed to be ultimately about power. But it was ironic to do the waves at the same time as I was doing the Freud drawings, because they seemed to be connected. But the bombs, what was interesting about the bombs is when I did the bomb exhibition, I started that exhibition with the drawing of Einstein's office, the day that he died. It was kind of like, I wanted to kind of like connect the two because they seem to be important. But that idea of making these drawings that basically trying to draw absence, that was what I was basically trying to do. Was how do you create presence in a picture that doesn't exist?
Not to get away from this, but there's something else I felt like was important to talk about, which is the work with the charcoal, which seems like such an inexact tool, yet the drawings are so precise, they look like photographs. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about your process, but I don't know how you got so much life out of black.
The thing is, I think the thing about drawing to me is that when I first started off early on in the 70s, when I ended up drawing because I didn't have money to buy supplies. I was working at the kitchen. I took home some backdrop paper and I drew on the paper. And ultimately, I realized I had this incredible respect for painting. That drawing to me seemed to be like this kind of crack between mediums, of sculpture and painting. It seemed to be an area that I could explore. And that drawing was like, to me, very direct in that way. That it wasn't. Painting to me always seemed to be like a covering, where drawing seemed to be very direct. And the process of drawing that I use is like very much opposite of traditional painting. Like traditional painting, if you would be painting a tree, you paint dark green first, and then you gradually work your way up to a lighter color. Whereas for me, I start off with a white piece of paper and work towards dark. And so all the white in drawing is the white of the paper. So it's kind of like a backwards to paint. But at the same time, this idea of the photograph, I think, was really important, because I think somewhere, like, you have like traditional representation and you have modernist abstraction, and somewhere I want to believe I exist somewhere in between there. So I think that the idea that we even remember in photographs, I think the whole idea of photograph, I think maybe what I'll do is translate photographs. So my work, although it's so photographically based, has been so altered from the original photographs that it could never be a photograph. In that sense, it's like I try to amplify the image of it in that sense. But there's always, the images are always not images that could be photographs in that sense. That's really, really important to me.
So, along those lines, you said you're doing Franz Klein, drawings of Franz Klein painting. What's the connection between the drawings and art as opposed to photography? I've been thinking about doing this for a while. It's at the studio. I just started doing it recently.
I read this article about how Franz Klein had done these drawings of chairs for a long time. These little drawings of chairs. And he went to visit de Kooning, and de Kooning was all excited to show him about this new toy he had called a projector, where he was putting images in and projecting, which is basically how I work. And I thought it was so bizarre. His abstract expressions were actually using projectors, and the idea that Franz Klein's images were actually of chairs. I thought they were these bold. So what I was trying to do by drawing, what I wanted to do is I wanted to learn how to draw abstractly. So I figured I might as well go to the masters to figure out how to do it. So by trying to draw a painting seemed to be like some kind of twisted dichotomy for me in that sense, because there's so much to me that my work is incredibly abstract on a certain level, even though it's representational, because I think that abstraction ultimately becomes representational after a period of time. You know, like Jackson Pollock is, if you make a painting that looks like Jackson Pollock, it's like this representation of Jackson Pollock.
It reminds me of a very old saw with some creative writing teachers when they had students. The exercise was in their own handwriting, write out the first 3 pages of a great book. You know, it's just sort of trace the letters. You know, you went on a journey where in the 80s, you know, there was a couple of guys that were considered, you know, the gods of, you know, what was happening. I remember it was you and David Sally, Eric Fischel, and Schnabel and Cindy Sherman. And is there some way you could describe, you know, your personal journey from the height of that to Europe to back, and how you feel about yourself back then compared to how you feel about your work now and what you're doing now that's evolved?
You know, it's interesting. This book is like I have a lot of young assistants that have come to work for me, and I was telling Rich about this, that they came and they wanted to work for me because of this work that they had seen I'd done, and then all of a sudden, as they're hanging out at the studio, they look at the books on the shelves and they go like, "Oh, you're the guy that did that." And it's like, I realized they didn't know that I'd done Men in Cities or these combines and everything. I thought that was really kind of interesting, but that this, I think the hardest thing is to stay alive and stay relevant, and in that sense, that to me has been the motivation of it. I think at one point, life got really rocky for us in the early 90s, and at one point we actually were thinking about moving back to Europe. My wife is an actress, and she could work anytime she wanted over there, so we made this kind of like plan. If I can't get it together in the next 4 years, we're leaving. And the beginning, the first Freud drawings in the United States, we sold like 1 or 2 to the museum, but then when I showed them in Europe, they exploded in Europe. The waves were a little bit slower, it took a little bit more time for that to catch on, and it's been a very slow, incremental rebuilding of my own career in that sense. But I think I'm making the best work I ever at this point now. It's like, the thing is, now the system is almost like at a point now where it's like, I'm getting a little uncomfortable because it's like, it almost seems like, I don't, dare I say it's too easy, but that's not the right expression. I almost think I'm supposed to change because it's working. It's like kind of a weird mentality, but the thing is that the system that I've developed is constantly revealing itself into the next step. It's like really weird how each step happens. Like the waves happened because of my kid was surfing. The bombs happened because 9/11 happened, and my art dealer Helene sent me a photograph of because I started putting smoke from 9/11 into the drawings of the waves, and she sent me this photograph of the bombs, of the tower collapsing, but it came out of the printer upside down, so it was, instead of being the towers and the smoke, it was like the smoke and the towers, and I thought, this looks just like a bomb. And I remember taking home all these old Life magazines to look at, and then my youngest son walks by and he says to me, "What's that?" And I said, what do you think that is? He says, "It's a hurricane." And I thought, wow, this is like, he thinks it's nature. And it's like man trying to be God, trying to be... Anyway, all of a sudden there was a sign that said, "Go that way." So all of a sudden, I started... It was like through things that either in the world or personally happened, each time a new series happened, it just kind of like the door opened, like the planets opened because of... I did the show at the Aspen Institute for Physics. They had this show, it was the 150th anniversary of Einstein. So they took 8 drawings of bombs and the Einstein desk drawing to this exhibition hall to open up this 150th anniversary for Einstein. So in this room, it was like an octagon. There were these huge drawings of bombs. In the middle, before the show opened, they had conducted meetings for nuclear proliferation with all these generals and stuff like that. I thought this was really great. All these assholes are sitting there with pictures. I kept thinking of, at the same time Rumsfeld was going, when the whole thing with Abu Ghraib happened, he's going, "Oh look, I never knew what this really looked like." I kept on thinking that these guys are sitting in rooms talking about bombs surrounded by these pictures. It was like kind of like the Goya's like living room or something like that. But the thing was, I went to that opening, and all they were talking, Brian Greene was talking, and they were all talking about the universe. And so I come home from that experience thinking a lot about the universe, and then all of a sudden school starts, and my youngest son and my middle son, he's taking physics, and my youngest son is learning the planets. Which, of course, what does young boy, what planet does he choose? But of course, Uranus.
Right.
But all of a sudden, it was like say, "Go that way." So all of a sudden, again, it was like, you have to be, the antennas have to be up enough that you can see the signs which way to go. I think that's really important, to be open enough to say, okay, that's the way you should go. But the thing was, they really seem to be like these chunks of things that I wanted to investigate.
Yeah, you have a show opening in Berlin coming up.
That happened. You want to show a picture? You want to show the picture?
I don't think I saw this picture, but I thought you had a show coming up. But, this is like a stupid aside. I remember when my daughter had, in 4th grade, they had a show where every child had to be a planet. I just remember her standing up there shouting at the top of,
What planet did you?
"I'm Uranus." Sorry, I mean, that has nothing to do with anything. Your films. One, I want to ask you about Johnny Mnemonic and Arena Brains, but I also see things that remind me of directors who I think took their influence from you. I mean, the obvious one are the agents in the Matrix, and you seem like a variation on Corporate Wars. And the other thing, there's this TV show I never watched called Fringe. It's sort of like a third-rate X Factor. X-Files, sorry. X Factor, and the coming attraction of it was a kid blowing daffodils, and the parents in slow motion going, "Watch out!" And then we see these guys that look like straight out of Corporate Wars, and the alien agents, and they're coming up over the rise on this iconic meadow, and some refugee from Beverly Hills 90210 now plays a dad. And he's going, "Jocelyn," and so she's going to be snatched by, Longo's guys, and I feel like there's a lot of crossbreeding between images and movies and images that you give back to movies.
It's interesting because in the 80s, I had this grand plan that I was appropriating images from the culture, and it seemed that the logical extension would be that I would eventually make a movie so that I could appropriate my own movie. I mean, I was totally out of control in the 80s, but I mean, I think part of that is why I think I should do some good work. I think it's interesting, like the whole thing about drugs, it's like, when drugs don't work, it's like eventually...
When they work?
Eventually, I realized when they didn't, but anyway. But the thing is that this idea that I wanted to make a movie, I was so obsessed with that idea of making. But when I finally got the chance to make a movie, I realized this is one of the most difficult things possible to actually try to do what you want to do. It was like this idea that when you go to the store and you buy a little can of paint, and for $5 you bring it home and you open it up and it's the wrong color, multiply that by like $20 million, it's just like making a movie. Except there's some guy on the phone going, "Make it redder!"
Tell me about it.
So, I mean, that experience was an interesting experience for me, but then I had this really strange experience where this idea of influences of having worked with drugs, it's the idea that I wanted to make work that wasn't so much stylistically recognizable, but that was more like permeated the world a little bit more. My middle son said, I said to him, I said, "I don't see any style in what I do," and he said to me, "You're just trying to own all the black and white images in the world." I felt like I had been caught, and it was a strange experience.
Actually, when I was looking through the drawings of the sleeping infants, they just seem like Kubrick to me. Space Odyssey, whatever, 2001. That's the future, by the way. I mean, it still felt like that apocalyptic feeling, that he gave us in that movie, and that you happen to sort of capture and explode on canvas. And so here comes the dumb question. Other than Kubrick, who were your cinematic heroes? I'm assuming Kubrick.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Definitely, but it's too big. It's too big. I mean, Coppola. Yeah, it's too big. Too big. In a weird way, it's like almost too much. Because also you start to remember movies more like in bits and pieces. You don't remember.
Yeah.
But the thing that's interesting about those kids and stuff like that is I had seen 2001, and around the time that I started realizing how insane the world was with Bush as president at that point, I started thinking so much about my kids, about I think it's interesting when if you're fortunate enough to have a certain amount of success in life. I think what starts to happen is you start to think about the future, about what you're going to leave behind, not your own work, but what kind of world you're going to leave behind. And the whole thing with having 3 sons, I started thinking about what kind of fucking world I'm leaving here, and these images of kids. I don't know how it happened. I stumbled onto a thing on the internet where I stumbled on finding pictures of children, but I didn't know who they were. And so what I did is I thought about this idea about these sleeping children that I didn't want. The idea, do I want them to wake up to the world and stuff like that? And it's also interesting is my youngest son was just at, he was no longer a kid. He was just becoming like 15 years old. But I realized I was making pictures of babies while I was losing my baby. It was like kind of pathetic, but it was like these. And all the images of the children come from the internet. I don't know who they are. I changed their names or whatever names are. But this idea of dealing with this kind of severance of these heads floating in the space that you don't know if they're going to wake up or not. But the whole idea, I kept on thinking about how fucked up the world was. Do I want these kids to actually wake up to it? So, but definitely, we were talking about the Tree of Life. When I saw that movie, I kind of like went, this is. I felt this connection to that movie for sure.
Well, Tree of Life going from prehistoric to small town Texas, it sort of reminded me of, in a way, a little bit of the Magellan drawings. And when they're presented in the book, I don't think there's all 366 in the book, but it was just like the pages were jam-packed, like 9/11 notes. Have you seen him? Have you seen her? But if you took all the images and they were all over the place, yet it felt like if you could, I've said this before, but I mean, it felt like if you could load them up into a Gatling gun and spit them out, you just like spit out the last 50 years of American life and dread and love and fear of the future.
Do you remember my cousin Regina?
I went out with her. Oh, no, I don't remember.
I have, the thing that's what's interesting here is that when I started doing this series, I think it's always dangerous for artists to read like serious, like Freud and things like that, because I was reading a lot of Jung, so I became really fascinated with this idea of the collective unconscious. And I kept on thinking like, wow, because we met Magellan, I thought, maybe I could get to the point of actually dealing with the images of collective unconscious. What are those images? And then I played with her, and then I just said, fuck it, I can't figure it out. This is like, so anyway.
That's why it's unconscious.
But then what's really weird, at one Christmas dinner, right around after the time I finished doing the Sharks, my cousin Regina, she's kind of slow. She's a Christian fundamentalist, and she's a really big Star Trek fan. So if you can put these two together, it's kind of bizarre. But she said to me, your work is like Genesis, and it was really weird. I sat and I looked at the Bible and I looked at the list of stuff, and I started realizing that in that first 7 series in the book called Essentials, it basically I kind of hit at all these elements that became like Genesis, and I kept thinking, are these basically kind of like images of the collective unconscious? And it was really weird when I hit the Sharks. I hit like a brick wall, and I didn't want to do any more groups of work. It kind of exploded. It became like this kind of random. What ends up following in that series are these series called Mysteries, which is basically everything. It's like I made the world, and now I had to populate the world. That's what became next episode. So the way the book is set up, it has its own narrative.
I remember talking to you. It must have been 1980, and I was into therapy, and you hadn't experienced it, and you had said to me, well, I'd be afraid to go into therapy because I feel like if I started understanding myself, I wouldn't be able to create art. And I just felt at that time, man, you should have a therapist so good. But yeah, I remember that. And does therapy affect how you approach art at all? Your own?
We went to the same therapist first.
Oh, yeah, I didn't realize. I forgot I sent him to this guy.
The first therapist I went
He
to.
was institutionalized 6 months later.
But that was, yeah, it's funny because I have friends that don't want to go to therapists because they're afraid they'll it'll like destroy their creative juices. I think that for me it's actually been helpful because also it helps me realize, helps me see. Also, the other thing is if you get to a certain point, like if you have a certain degree of success, you can't to bitch to anybody. You know, I was just saying to you, like, what am I going to bitch about? I don't have my retrospective at MoMA. Who do I bitch to about? And the only person I could bitch that about would be Cindy. I mean, it's like my life is great. I need somebody to complain to. Ultimately, that's what the therapy functions as. You know, I mean, my art is a way I complain differently, but you know, I think my art to me is more my rage. Complaining is more for therapy. If I made complaining art, that'd be really fucking awful, man.
Well, you know, if you can make it rhyme and stuff, you'd be like Billy Joe. But I also remember from that time, you know, given what you're talking about in terms of children and how it impacted your worldview, is, you know, I remember when we were friends and we had a kid in 1984, and it's like we were all staring at it. What is it? You know, and you know, it was like the greatest hobby in the world. You know,
back then, kids were seemed like fashion accessories.
I just felt like, you know, can you return it? You know, to the pet shop. But I remember, you know, and I was like, well, you know, I'm a father. Life is divided into either you're a father or you're a son. You know, and it's like, and you just said to me, let me tell you about, why would I want to have kids? I'm my own kid. And I also, but I also felt that in your work at that time, you know, that there was this kid thing going on, you know, that was very, you know, educated and sculpted, you know, into this beautiful art. But there was also somebody who just, it was Brooklyn, it was Manhattan, it was just very, I remember looking at your stuff, and, you know, especially all your zombies, that, you know, the monster you created, but also, you know, the battling black-suited guys and the falling men and women. And as I was looking at it, in the back of my head, I had this fantasy of you drawing this stuff and doing your own like soundtrack from a battle movie, like you know, I just sort of felt like there was this like crazy ass like projects kid, you know, that somehow managed to become brilliant in art, you know, but was still, you know, he was like playing with soldiers, you know, there was this like great like charisma. I keep saying charisma. I'm going to stop now. Let's have a kid and name her Charisma. But I mean, there was something there that built a connection between you and I. Just like when I started writing about street gangs, you know, that was part of my fascination. It's like, yeah, I'm going to show you, yeah, and then the guy goes over here and kills that guy, and, you know, comes back and talks to this girl and punches this guy, and he drops a truck on his head. You know,
one of the greatest images I remember is like, I got to the point where I was basically, I was working all the time, and Richard started, I think you were doing the research for Clockers, right? And you had babies born, right?
Yeah.
Both of them?
I don't know.
I remember you coming to my studio with at least one little kid. And you're standing in the studio with the kid crawling around your feet, and you're telling me about all these like horrible fucking murders and shit you saw in Newark and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was bouncing around.
While this kid is like crawling around.
You won't believe what they do with the syringe where it goes. You know.
The guy that got shot with an X across his chest or something. It was really weird. I also realized you were out in the world, and I was like, it's also really weird that sometimes I realize how kind of antisocial I've become, that I don't feel the necessity to go out in the world because I'm real happy in my studio where I can make my own world. It's like kind of like, in that sense, it's kind of, I mean, I'm real happy. unfortunately, I'm a lot more social than I used to be, I think.
Well, you were pretty damn social back then. I remember, but and it's kind of fascinating to me way because I always felt like I was a little too old, like I missed the boat, like I didn't know what CBGB stood for. But I mean, you're about 4 years younger than me, and like I said, I was very new to the art world, and the art world was being made new by you and a number of artists at that period. But I remember the Beehive, that was your studio back then, and the people that would just be there, like Stuart Albright, this bald guy sleeping on your couch. I wasn't quite sure what he was up to, and going to parties, and I just felt like a little bit like somebody's grandfather, but not really, maybe somebody's uncle. But just the people that came through that funky ass place on South Street, 85 South Street, and I just remember seeing Bosky out there, and Gretchen, and Rocket's Red Glare, and Rene Ricard, and I mean, this part of our life at that point was going into the bathroom and coming out and looking like somebody dipped your face in lemon meringue without the lemon, and it was my turn. Everybody was walking around with this like reverse red nose, and I just remember the jam sessions we would have over this movie Steel Angel that we were going to do with Eric Bogosian. That I mean, this is all leading to like drugs, not drugs, but at that time I remember saying to my ex, I'm going down to Longo's. We're going to work on the movie, and getting down there at about midnight, and we'd sit around, we'd talk, and we'd look at each other, and then I'd say, I got this stuff, and emptying out my wallet, and just finding like, it's like dandruff in there, it's just finding these odd wax things. It wasn't enough, and you had the idea you were going to bring out vitamin A capsules, and we were going to crush the vitamin A capsules to mix them with the pathetic Coke that I had. The Coke dealer I had would have been arrested for impersonating a Coke dealer. It was so weak. We were pikers, but I just remember like smashing that vitamin A into the Coke, and just like we did lines, and then we have these like vitamin A balls hanging from our nose hairs.
The thing about drugs ultimately seemed to be about work. It was like always like how do you use drugs to keep. It wasn't about partying. It was always thinking about how do you stay up an extra hour longer. The irony of all is I'm sober. I mean, I had a crash a while ago, so it's like it's kind of funny to be like on that point where it's like trying to make decisions, thinking about when I wasn't sober and how excessive I was, and how now I have a little bit more judicious take on what I have to do. But it took a long time to get to a place with my work where I was before. It was really hard to do in that sense. What? Sorry.
Anyway, so I mean, my experience those nights, we had some great ideas, and we'd talk our balls off, and it went on like that, and something happened, and I never really quite got to writing, and then I went away to Italy for 30 days, and I came back, and I was clean. And then I wrote the script in about like a week. And I said, here's the script, and you went, what? Wait a minute, hold on. I said, where's my drawing? And I just turned into like a lunatic. I think maybe you were more productive than me back then. My experience of trying to create in the 80s on drugs was just sharpening a ton of pencils and talking my ass off in a bar about irons in the fire. But I got a sense that you could work through anything.
There's definitely a point where it hit the brick wall, for sure. I mean, I know I hit the brick wall, for sure. But you start to realize that everybody has great ideas. It's all how you do it.
Or if you do it,
Yeah. immense enthusiasm. The thing is just to be lucky enough to actually be lucky enough to actually make work is like, you know, we're really incredibly lucky that we get to do what we want to do, you know? Instead of having like real jobs.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to complaining. You know, who are you going to complain to? Well, do you have I mean, I feel like I gave a very lame-ass interview here, but
No, it's fine.
I haven't seen Robert, really talk to Robert, it feels like since the early 90s, just once. So, I mean, I feel like I have so much catching up to do. I feel almost like to ask you formal questions, you know, I'm like bursting out of my skin to talk to you. You know, now I just feel like bottled, you know. So, you know.
It's amazing to know somebody at the formative years and realize we were sitting talking and realize that the connection is still continuing. It's like it's interesting getting old, for sure. If you have any questions?
Any questions?
More intensely, do you take a grandma as an apprentice?
I have no. I'm not against grandmas.
Maybe you can repeat the question.
Maybe first one.
You're asking if I take a grandma as an apprentice.
I still can't hear what you guys say. The microphone.
I'm sorry. Do I take a grandma as an apprentice? So the thing is, actually, I have no problems with it. But I have my studio is I have a really great studio. I have a really great group of people. So I'm not even I can't even imagine having anybody else right now.
No,
But you know what? The thing is as the idea of working for an artist, I think I did it. I think it's if there's an artist that you like, you go knock on the door and say, I want to work for you. That's really that simple. I mean, that's what I did, and I think that's the best way to learn and to see. The thing is art school is a really kind of problematic thing. They try to teach you art, but one thing they don't teach you in art school is how to be an artist. And that's what I do with my assistants. I teach them, they work for me, but I actually teach them how to be an artist. They see what daily routine bullshit you do, you do on a daily basis to be an artist. I think it's really important that when you work for an artist, you can actually see how one does it. I think that's really important.
Okay, I'll be knocking on your door.
What artist did you work for?
I worked for Vito Acconci for a long time. I worked for Dennis Oppenheim for a while. Those were the two main ones I worked for. I worked for Vito actually for a real while, but the last job I did for Vito I hired David Sally, Troy Brontok, and Jack Goldstein to help me do an installation at the clock tower that involved these anyway, we were completely incompetent. It was when Vito, shortly after that, actually hired real people. It was like, we were the last artist to work for. Anybody else? Thank you.